In this presentation, the Department of City Planning aims to provide an overview of the Wildlife Ordinance, including a detailed summary of proposed regulations and noting changes made to the 2021 draft. Please reference the previous video recording Part 1 for more information on the background of the proposed Wildlife Ordinance. As mentioned in Part 1 of this video presentation, the Wildlife District serves as a critical connection to wildlife in the region. These maps here provide some context of the city's hillside areas, including the areas already identified for their regional natural resource value. The county's significant ecological areas, which you see in green on the map to the far left, and the rim of the valley corridor, which you see in brown also on the map to the far left. It also shows these same areas are vulnerable to fire and are identified as very high fire hazard severity zones, shown in red. The map on the right shows probable pathways for wildlife movement within the city, identified by the consultant to the wildlife team. To assist the team, the city hired biological consultants to identify areas in the city that are ecologically sensitive. Some of the factors that were taken into consideration included identifying areas in proximity to large, undeveloped natural open spaces, as well as areas that contain intact vegetation and water resources. These identified areas, which are shown in green in this map, are being referred to as the Preliminary Protection Areas for Wildlife, or PAWS. The Wildlife District was subsequently selected based on this study and the Council's direction and represents a smaller subset of the PAWS, shown here in yellow. The Planning Department originally released a draft of the Wildlife Ordinance in May 2021. After receiving and incorporating extensive public comment and feedback on the original draft, the city then re-released a revised ordinance in 2022. This 2022 draft includes revisions that address concerns raised by the public and aims to minimize complexity and maximize efficiency and effectiveness of implementation. Some of the significant changes to the 2022 draft include the establishment of a wildlife supplemental use district that includes a process for requesting relief, an adjustment to the boundary to remove overlap with the Ventura-specific plan along the northern boundary and alignment with the hillside construction regulations, HCR boundary along the southern edge, and changes to types of development activities that will be regulated by the ordinance. The proposed Wildlife Ordinance District can be viewed in detail on an interactive map located on the wildlife website at planningforla.org/wildlife. The proposed Wildlife Ordinance District generally includes the communities between the 405 and 101 freeways in the Santa Monica Mountains, including the neighborhoods of Hollywood, Laurel Canyon, Bel Air, Beverly Crest, Sherman Oaks, and Studio City. Once adopted, it is intended that the regulations proposed in the ordinance would eventually be expanded to all the PAWS throughout the city. The Wildlife District area is subject to regulations in the Baseline Hillside Ordinance, the Hillside Construction Regulations, the Mulholland-specific plan, as well as to regulations associated with the underlying zones. Proposed regulations were developed with the intention that they would work together with existing provisions to achieve objectives for wildlife and improve sustainable outcomes in the hillsides. With so many existing regulations in place, you may ask, why do we need more regulations? These images illustrate housing developments that are becoming more typical in the hillsides as property owners seek to maximize their cost of development in very constrained areas. Many of the lots that are vacant today are extremely sloped, located within landslide areas, or contain vegetation and wildlife habitat. These newest developments tend to be larger than in the past, and they involve large quantities of grading, tree and vegetation removal, and tend to leave little or no open space between properties. These types of developments result in constrained or obstructed wildlife pathways and ultimately lead to increased habitat fragmentation and native habitat loss. To address these development patterns, the Wildlife District regulations propose additional measures such as extra setback widths and wildlife-friendly fencing of yards, modified lot coverage limits, requirements for native planting, limitations on construction near waterways, as well as further limitations on grading on steep slopes. Whereas the 2021 draft ordinance standards were intended to apply broadly to any project requiring a grading permit, including pools, patios, driveways, and fences, the 2022 revised draft mainly applies to development activities that have the greatest impact on wildlife, including landform and vegetation disturbance. Projects that would be subject to the proposed wildlife ordinance regulations include new construction, major remodels, additions over 500 square feet, projects involving grading of more than 500 cubic yards, project sites located within a wildlife resource buffer, as well as any project involving tree removals. In general, existing developed properties do not need to comply with the new regulations unless they are undertaking substantial remodeling. Small remodels, such as adding a room or addition that is less than 500 square feet, will not be subject to new regulations unless those properties are located within a wildlife resource buffer. So while new construction is the focus of the proposed regulations, existing houses, especially when remodeled in ways that are consistent with wildlife goals, can also contribute to wildlife-friendly development. Existing citywide rules that govern rebuilding and nonconformities will continue to apply. No changes are being proposed to these provisions. The municipal code contains the standards by which pre-existing structures may be rehabilitated or rebuilt following damage or destruction in a disaster. If the value of repairs or restoration are under 75% of the total valuation of the home, owners may rebuild the structure as long as permits for restoration have been obtained within 2 years of the date of damage. If the value of repairs exceeds 75% of the total valuation of the home, structures may still be rebuilt if the following conditions are met. That is, the building is not constructed where a public street exists or is planned, the building does not exceed the current allowable height, and the building meets current yard standards. I will now detail some of the regulations proposed that are aimed to preserve access to habitat and to facilitate wildlife movement. The 2022 draft removed complexity for setbacks and provided more options for complying with wildlife-friendly fencing standards. Front, side, and rear yard requirements are already required for properties within the wildlife district. The 2022 draft maintains the front yard setback minimum of 10 feet and removes the allowance for prevailing setbacks that result in zero or reduced setbacks. Existing city regulations already limit fence height to 3.5 feet within the front yard and 6 feet within side and rear yards. The wildlife ordinance introduces additional regulations that help achieve more wildlife-friendly fencing. To be considered wildlife-friendly, any portion or segment of fencing above 3.5 feet must be 50% open to allow for wildlife to safely move through. Additionally, fencing materials that are hazardous to wildlife, including spikes, glass, barbed wire, and other mesh materials, are prohibited. The 2022 revised draft adds multiple options for how to comply with wildlife-friendly standards. The first option requires any fencing along the property perimeter to meet the wildlife-friendly fence and wall standards. This option is likely to be most suitable for larger lots. To provide flexibility for smaller or irregular-sized lots, a second option allows the property owner to incorporate wildlife-friendly fencing in either one of the side yard setbacks or in the rear yard setback. Property owners will still be allowed to construct solid security fencing outside of setback areas. These options will allow flexibility for homeowners to build various fences, walls, and hedges for privacy and security as long as they leave some portion of their property permeable to wildlife. And because parcels in the hillsides vary in shape and terrain, to promote biodiversity and maintain ecosystems, site plan review is proposed for properties that contain sensitive wildlife resources, such as waterways and riparian corridors, and sites that are located within 50 feet of open spaces and natural areas. This is changed from the 2021 draft, which prohibited such development. In response to public requests, An interactive map of wildlife resource buffers and ridgelines have been provided on the project's website at planningforla.org/wildlife. This online map is searchable by entering in an address that is within the Wildlife Ordinance District. Wildlife resources are defined as features that provide benefits to wildlife habitat and movement, such as access to food, water, shelter, and corridors, as well as features that provide ecosystem services such as trees and vegetation, water recharge, and slope stability. The resources map was created with the latest local, state, and federal data to identify areas in the Wildlife District where potential waterways and riparian corridors are known to exist. Data sources include such agencies as the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Geological Survey, the California Protected Areas Dataset in LA County. As mentioned previously, if a property is located within a resource buffer, additional rules apply, such as the requirement for site plan review when grading activity exceeds 50 cubic yards. Another key set of standards aimed at promoting biodiversity is found in the landscaping and vegetation section of the ordinance, which takes into account fire hazards that are prevalent in hillside areas. New development projects involving landscaping would be required to select plants from a preferred native plant list that includes species suitable for the Santa Monica Mountains climate and topography. The ordinance would prohibit planting invasive species which can diminish biodiversity and contribute to fire hazards. The draft wildlife ordinance attempts to balance the goals of fire safety and preserving habitat by aligning vegetation requirements to LA County fire zone requirements. New development projects containing landscaped areas will be required to comply with these planting zones and the minimum native plant coverage area.
One of the primary approaches to protecting wildlife habitat and connectivity is to minimize the site disturbance associated with residential development projects through new standards regulating grading, residential floor area, and lot coverage, which refine and strengthen standards in the baseline hillside ordinance, hillside construction regulations, and low-impact development standards. Grading controls are very straightforward ways to preserve natural topography and landforms, as well as vegetation, soil nutrients, and healthy functional watersheds on which wildlife and people rely. Residential floor area regulates the overall size of new construction and decreases the pressure to expand construction on the least suitable terrain of a property. The proposed lot coverage standards reinforce similar benefits by managing a range of activities including paving, excavation for pools, and the construction of recreation facilities such as tennis courts that can have a significant impact on the landscape and ecosystem. Rules related to grading, steep slopes, and RFA are meant to encourage the location of development activities on the portion of sites where they will have less impact on existing landforms and ground cover. They also enable the city to better regulate building scale and grading volumes that have been increasing over time. The 2022 draft keeps these important grading controls, but also ensures that applicants can utilize the minimum guaranteed residential floor area according to the baseline hillside ordinance. The revised draft also introduces site plan review for projects proposing more than 1,000 cubic yards of remedial grading. This is a graph of the average square footage for permits for demolition and new construction in the wildlife pilot study area since the year 2000. It illustrates how the average size of hillside development has increased since 2010, despite ordinances, including BHO and HCR, meant to limit the size and impact of these projects. It also illustrates that in the last 10 years, smaller existing developments have been replaced with projects nearly twice as large on average. The 2022 draft also requires site plan review for projects proposing 7,500 square feet or more of total residential floor area to more closely address the impacts of larger projects on wildlife and the environment. This is a lower threshold than the 10,000 square feet proposed in the 2021 draft. The 2021 draft proposed lot coverage limits and landscaping minimums based on impermeable surfaces and lot size. The 2022 draft has simplified these standards by eliminating complex formulas and simplifying the definition of lot coverage. A single lot coverage maximum of 50% of the lot area is proposed for any size lot and includes basements and structures such as pools and tennis courts. Total lot coverage is proposed to be less than 50% of the lot area and is also capped at 100,000 square feet for any size lot, whichever amount is less. Ridgelines are an important topographic feature for wildlife movement and irreplaceable scenic resources for people living in and around the hills of Los Angeles. So the Wildlife Ordinance has incorporated specific ridgeline development standards. The previously proposed Ridgeline Protection Ordinance, RPO, was integrated into a single effort with the Wildlife Ordinance earlier this year. The Wildlife Ordinance has incorporated public feedback received from the RPO process, although there are important differences between the previously proposed and revised regulations. The 2022 draft includes the ridgelines previously identified in the formally proposed RPO, but does not separate them into pristine and non-pristine ridgelines with different standards. Utilizing the larger boundary associated with the proposed wildlife district, staff identified additional ridgelines, roughly doubling the total length of protected ridgelines. They are now proposed to be regulated under a single set of standards. Additionally, many of the district-wide regulations will serve to protect ridgelines, including those regulating grading, lot coverage, residential floor area, tree retention, and lighting. Let's look at the specific ridgeline regulations first. For properties within 50 vertical or horizontal feet of ridgelines, the Wildlife Ordinance proposes an envelope height of 25 feet and an overall height of 35 feet, allowing for two-story homes, addressing concerns that the original protections were too restrictive. This replaces the RPO's proposed height limit of 18 feet exceeding the ridgeline. Envelope height is a continuous limit measured from grade that minimizes the visual impact of development on the top of the ridgeline. This was modified in response to feedback on the initial proposal of a one-story limitation and now proposes to allow new development and remodels to build to a height of 2 stories. An overall height restriction is meant to limit the overall development impact on the slopes of ridgeline sites. Overall height is measured from the lowest point to the highest point of a structure and addresses the tiered or cascading effect of development on the downward slope of the ridgeline. In order to maintain wildlife connectivity across ridgelines so that wildlife don't have to travel long distances around rows of houses, an additional side yard setback is proposed for properties within 50 feet of a ridgeline. For a new project, the additional side yard dimensions would add 50% more setback on one side of the property. For instance, where 5-foot side yards are required on a ridgeline, the proposed regulations would result in one 5-foot side yard and one 7.5-foot side yard for new development. Standards for lighting, windows, and trash enclosures can minimize disruptive and dangerous conditions for wildlife and reduce unwanted interactions with people and pets. The proposed regulations require lighting to be shielded away from open spaces to encourage natural wildlife behavior as well as darker night skies. It minimizes the risk to birds from transparent windows and surfaces that they can't see and reflective surfaces that can appear as open sky or tree canopy. Standards for trash enclosures minimize attractive hazards to wildlife and keep human-wildlife interaction to a minimum. The proposed regulations work holistically with other important goals to provide the greatest benefit in the most sensitive and important areas for wildlife. The department released a revised version of the Wildlife Ordinance to the public in April of 2022. A public hearing is being planned for July and notices will be mailed to all properties within the proposed wildlife district. Additional outreach, including this video presentation and a Q&A opportunity, are anticipated prior to the staff public hearing. Additional hearings by the City Planning Commission and City Council will follow later in 2022. We'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the entire team to thank the public, community members, advocates, and subject matter experts who have contributed questions, comments, and feedback to this important and exciting project. Again, please feel free to visit the project webpage at planning4la.org/wildlife for more information. You can submit public comments or questions in advance of the public hearing to ourla2040@lacity.org.